By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a new and dangerous phase. The initial optimism that followed the Allied landings in Normandy had faded, replaced by exhaustion, logistical strain, and bitter resistance. American forces had advanced hundreds of miles across France in just a few months, but speed came at a cost. Supply lines were stretched thin, units were depleted, and replacement troops often arrived faster than they could be properly integrated. Eastern France presented a very different battlefield from the beaches of Normandy or the hedgerows of the Bocage. The Vosges Mountains formed a natural defensive barrier, stretching north to south along the Franco-German border. Thick forests, steep ridges, narrow valleys, and limited road networks made large-scale maneuver difficult. Visibility was often reduced to a few dozen meters, especially in rain or fog. Artillery observation was poor. Armor movement was restricted. Infantry bore the brunt of the fighting. For German forces retreating toward their homeland, the Vosges offered an opportunity to slow the Allied advance. Even weakened units could inflict heavy casualties by using terrain, camouflage, and well-prepared defensive positions. The forests concealed movement and allowed German troops to ambush advancing Americans, forcing them to fight uphill for every ridge and hilltop. The U.S. Army units assigned to this sector were already worn down. Among them was the 36th Infantry Division, a National Guard formation that had seen hard fighting in Italy before being redeployed to France. The division had suffered significant losses earlier in the campaign and was now reinforced by large numbers of replacement soldiers. Themselves were the key. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not just stepping stones, they were strategic prizes. Once captured, they would allow American B-29 superfortresses to strike the Japanese home islands directly. Japan understood this. If the Marianas fell, the war would move from distant island battles to direct attacks on Tokyo itself. For the Imperial Navy, this meant one thing. The U.S. carrier fleet had to be destroyed before it could protect the invasion forces. Japan's answer was a massive, all-or-nothing plan known internally as the Z Plan. It called for the full commitment of Japan's remaining carrier force, combined with hundreds of land-based aircraft operating from islands in the western Pacific. The idea was to overwhelm the Americans with sheer numbers, inflict heavy losses on their carriers, and force the United States into negotiations. It was a desperate gamble, but one Japan believed it still had to take. What the Japanese commanders didn't know was that their plan was already compromised. In March 1944, Admiral Minichi Koga, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, boarded a transport aircraft carrying detailed operational documents, including the Z Plan itself. The flight encountered severe weather, and Koga's aircraft crashed into the sea. While he was killed, portions of the documents survived. They eventually fell into Allied hands through Filipino guerrillas and were delivered to American intelligence. By the time Japan moved to execute its decisive battle, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his staff already knew where, when, and how the Japanese intended to strike. Armed with this knowledge, the U.S. Navy prepared Task Force 58, a massive carrier force unlike anything previously assembled. 15 fleet and light carriers, backed by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, steamed westward. More importantly, these carriers were filled with a new generation of fighter aircraft, the F-6F Hellcat. Designed specifically to counter the Japanese Zero, the Hellcat was faster, tougher, better armed, and far more forgiving to fly. Combined with radar-directed interceptions and disciplined formation tactics, it gave American pilots an overwhelming advantage. By mid-June, both fleets were closing in on one another. Japanese scouts fanned out across the Pacific in a desperate search for the American carriers. Early on the morning of June 19th, one of those scouts finally found its target. A lone Zero radioed back the position of Task Force 58. Moments later, in a gesture that perfectly symbolized the mindset of Japan's air arm by this stage of the war, the pilot announced he was attacking alone. He dove toward the American fleet and was quickly shot down. That single, futile attack was the opening shot of a battle that would define the end of Japanese naval aviation. Within hours, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft would rise into the sky, heading toward what they believed was their last chance at victory. Waiting for them were hundreds of American Hellcats circling at altitude, guided by radar, fueled by superior logistics, and flown by men who had trained longer, learned harder lessons, and now held every advantage. By the time the sun climbed high over the Philippine Sea, the sky itself would become a killing ground, and the nickname, Turkey Shoot, would be born not from exaggeration, but from grim, undeniable reality. By the time June 1944 arrived, the balance of power in the Pacific skies had already begun to tilt decisively, though the Japanese High Command had not yet fully accepted it. In the months leading up to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy continued to cling to the belief that one massive, decisive carrier battle could still reverse the course of the war. This belief was rooted in pre-war doctrine and reinforced by earlier successes, like Pearl Harbor, and the early carrier victories of 1941–42. What Japanese planners failed to grasp was that the war they were about to fight was no longer the war they had prepared for. The Americans had changed the rules, and by mid-1944, they were playing a very different game. On the American side, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his staff were preparing for Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not just stepping stones toward Japan, they were strategic linchpins. From these islands, the United States could deploy the new B-29 Superfortress bombers directly against the Japanese home islands. For Japan, losing the Marianas would mean losing the war's defensive perimeter and exposing the homeland to sustained bombardment. Both sides understood what was at stake, and both knew a massive naval confrontation was inevitable. Thanks to the recovered Z plan, American commanders knew exactly what the Japanese intended to do. Rather than disperse their forces or take unnecessary risks, Nimitz ordered Task Force 58 to concentrate its carriers and prepare for defense in depth. This force, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, was the most powerful carrier fleet ever assembled to that point. 15 fast carriers, 7 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, and more than 900 aircraft were now operating as a single, coordinated weapon. At the heart of this force was a fighter aircraft that would define the battle before it even began, the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was not elegant, nor was it especially graceful in the air. It was, however, brutally effective. Designed with direct lessons learned from early encounters with the Mitsubishi A6M0, the Hellcat traded some maneuverability for overwhelming advantages in speed, durability, firepower, and pilot survivability. It could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero, and its 6.50 caliber machine guns could tear enemy aircraft apart in seconds. Perhaps most importantly, American pilots flying the Hellcat were trained not to dogfight on Japanese terms. They were taught to boom and zoom, to attack from altitude, to disengage at will, and to rely on teamwork rather than individual heroics. By contrast, the Japanese air arm was in a state of quiet collapse. Years of attrition had hollowed out the veteran corps of naval aviators who had once dominated the Pacific. Training programs, rushed and under-resourced, produced pilots with minimal flight hours and little combat experience. Fuel shortages limited realistic training, and many new pilots were sent into battle having never fired their guns in anger. Aircraft production had fallen behind American output, and newer Japanese planes often lacked the armor, radios, and self-sealing fuel tanks that had become standard in American designs. On paper, Japan could still muster hundreds of aircraft. In reality, it could no longer field an air force capable of surviving sustained combat against a modern carrier fleet. As the Japanese fleet moved toward the Marianas in mid-June, their commanders remained confident. They believed their land-based aircraft on Guam, Rota, and Saipan would help soften the American fleet before carrier planes joined the fight. What they did not realize was that American strikes had already crippled many of these airfields. Bomb craters, destroyed hangars, and wrecked aircraft littered the runways. Maintenance crews struggled to keep planes operational, and pilots were forced to take off under chaotic conditions, often without proper coordination or escort. When the first Japanese reconnaissance planes went up on the morning of June 19th, they were already flying into a trap. American radar, far superior to anything the Japanese possessed, detected incoming aircraft at extreme range. This gave Task Force 58 an enormous advantage. Fighters could be launched, vectored, and positioned long before enemy planes came anywhere near the fleet. The sky itself had become a weapon, controlled by radar operators, fighter direction officers, and disciplined squadrons flying predetermined patrol zones. The lone Zero that spotted the American fleet that morning and immediately attacked was not an act of tactical brilliance. It was a symbol of desperation. That pilot's decision reflected the ethos drilled into Japanese aviators by 1944: attack without hesitation, regardless of odds. It also illustrated how disconnected Japanese doctrine had become from reality. Heroic sacrifice could not compensate for overwhelming technological and organizational superiority. Once the first wave of Japanese aircraft launched from Guam, the results were inevitable. Hellcats intercepted them while they were still climbing, engines straining, formations incomplete. American pilots described the experience as surreal. Enemy planes seemed to appear everywhere, yet posed little threat. Many Japanese pilots flew straight and level, easy targets for seasoned Americans who had hundreds of hours in combat conditions. Within minutes, the sky was filled with falling aircraft, burning wreckage, and parachutes drifting down toward the ocean. The Japanese losses that morning were not merely numerical, they were existential. Every plane destroyed represented a pilot Japan could not replace. Every failed attack weakened morale and reinforced the growing realization among survivors that they were flying into a one-sided slaughter. Meanwhile, American losses remained astonishingly low. Pilots who returned to their carriers spoke of engagements lasting seconds, not minutes. Some squadrons expended more ammunition than fuel. As the morning wore on, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft met the same fate. Combat air patrols rotated seamlessly, refueled and rearmed fighters taking the place of those returning to the deck. Damage control teams stood ready, but rarely had to act. Anti-aircraft gunners fired when necessary, but often watched as fighters annihilated attackers long before they came within range. By midday, it was clear to American commanders that the battle had already been decided. What followed was not a contest of equals, but a systematic dismantling of Japanese naval aviation. The term, "Turkey Shoot," first uttered casually by a pilot, spread quickly through the fleet. It was an apt description, capturing both the ease of the kills and the grim absurdity of the imbalance. As the sun climbed higher over the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy was losing the very thing that had once made it formidable. Aircraft carriers without air groups were little more than floating targets. Pilots without training were liabilities rather than assets. And doctrine without adaptation was a death sentence. By the end of the day, the skies belonged entirely to the United States Navy, and Japan's dream of a decisive carrier battle was collapsing in real time. The true scale of what was unfolding would not be fully understood until the following day, but even now, as burning aircraft fell into the sea and American fighters circled unchallenged, one thing was already certain: the era of Japanese carrier aviation dominance had ended forever. By the morning of June 19, 1944, both fleets knew that contact was inevitable. The Philippine Sea stretched wide and deceptively calm, but above it hung the largest carrier clash in history. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet was finally in position, and despite intelligence gaps and poor coordination, Japanese commanders believed they still possessed a decisive advantage. Their aircraft, they thought, had longer range. Their pilots, at least in theory, had combat experience. And most importantly, they believed American carrier decks would be caught by mast, crushing strikes launched from beyond U.S. fighter reach. Shortly after dawn, Japanese reconnaissance planes finally sighted the American fleet. The moment Ozawa received confirmation, he ordered the launch of the first wave. From the decks of 9 carriers, nearly 70 aircraft lifted into the air, 0 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes forming up over the horizon. This was only the beginning. Over the next several hours, Ozawa would commit more than 300 aircraft in 4 massive attack waves, throwing nearly his entire carrier air arm into battle. What Japanese planners had not accounted for was how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted. As the first wave flew eastward, American radar operators aboard Task Force 58 detected them almost immediately. This was the silent killer of the Japanese plan. Radar coverage extended hundreds of miles, giving American commanders nearly an hour's warning. On American flight decks, alarms sounded, crews sprinted, and fighter directors calmly began vectoring interceptors into position. The U.S. Navy had refined this system through years of brutal trial and error. Now it worked with terrifying efficiency. Grumman F-6F Hellcats began launching in massive numbers, climbing into the sky and forming layered defensive patrols. These were not scattered dogfights. They were controlled ambushes. Fighters were stacked at different altitudes, ready to pounce as the Japanese formations approached. Pilots received precise instructions from combat information centers, guiding them directly toward incoming enemies they could not yet see. When the first Japanese wave crossed into Hellcat range, it was met by a wall of American fighters. The results were immediate and devastating. Japanese formations disintegrated under coordinated attacks. Hellcats dove out of the sun, firing 6.50 caliber machine guns with crushing effect. Pilots reported enemy aircraft exploding midair, wings shearing off, engines erupting in flame. Many Japanese pilots never even reached bombing range. Others pressed on desperately, only to find American carriers already maneuvering at high speed, ringed by dense anti-aircraft fire. Those few attackers who survived long enough to release their weapons achieved almost nothing. Torpedoes missed. Bombs splashed harmlessly into the sea. Not a single American carrier was seriously damaged. Meanwhile, dozens of Japanese aircraft were destroyed within minutes. The second wave fared no better. Again, radar detected the incoming force. Again, Hellcats rose to intercept. Again, Japanese planes were cut down long before reaching the fleet. Some American pilots later described the battle as less like combat and more like target practice. Enemy pilots flew straight into prepared kill zones, often unaware they were already surrounded. One American aviator later recalled that Japanese planes came in beautifully lined up and never left that way. The third wave, launched in desperation, attempted a wider approach, hoping to bypass American fighter screens. Instead, it ran headlong into additional Hellcat patrols positioned specifically for that possibility. The result was even worse. Entire Japanese squadrons vanished from radar screens within minutes. Pilots reported shooting down multiple aircraft in a single engagement. The sky filled with smoke, wreckage, and falling bodies. Japanese losses mounted at an unimaginable rate. Aircraft carriers that had taken years to build were now launching their remaining pilots into near-certain death. Many of those pilots had received only minimal training. Fuel shortages had cut flight hours. Carrier landings, once a point of elite proficiency, had become rare skills. Even if they survived combat, many pilots lacked the ability to return safely to their ships. As the fourth and final wave launched late in the day, Ozawa's gamble collapsed entirely. American fighters intercepted them at extreme range. Few aircraft even reached the vicinity of the fleet. Of those that did, none achieved meaningful results. By sunset on June 19th, the scale of destruction was becoming clear. The Japanese had lost more than 300 aircraft in a single day. Hundreds of pilots, many irreplaceable, were dead or missing. The American losses were astonishingly small by comparison. Fewer than 30 U.S. aircraft had been lost, many due to fuel exhaustion rather than enemy fire. In several squadrons, pilots returned claiming 5 or more kills each. That evening, as American carriers recovered their aircraft, the decks were crowded with returning fighters low on fuel, some barely staying airborne. Night landings were chaotic and dangerous, yet even here American training prevailed. Pilots landed in darkness, guided by flares and radio calls, pushing their exhausted machines onto decks slick with oil and seawater. Japanese carriers, by contrast, faced catastrophe. Many pilots who survived combat could not find their ships. Others attempted night landings and crashed into the sea. The few who returned carried stories of annihilation. By the end of the first day, Japan's carrier aviation, once the spearhead of its empire, had been shattered beyond recovery. The next day would bring even more destruction. But the outcome was already sealed. The Marianas Turkey Shoot had earned its name. By the afternoon of June 19, 1944, the airspace above the Philippine Sea had become catastrophically hostile for the Imperial Japanese Navy. What had begun as an ambitious counterstrike intended to destroy the American carrier force had instead turned into a one-sided slaughter. The failure was not the result of a single mistake, but of years of cumulative weaknesses finally colliding with a modern, coordinated American naval air doctrine. Japanese pilots continued to launch attacks throughout the day, but by this point, they were flying into a wall of radar-directed fighters, layered anti-aircraft fire, and carrier groups operating with near-perfect coordination. One of the decisive advantages enjoyed by the U.S. Navy was its integrated radar system. American carrier task forces were now equipped with advanced early warning radar that could detect incoming enemy aircraft well before they came within visual range. Radar operators aboard carriers and escort ships tracked Japanese formations as they lifted off from distant bases and relayed vectors directly to fighter direction officers. These officers then guided Hellcat squadrons into optimal interception positions, often allowing American pilots to attack from above and behind, the most lethal angles in air combat. Japanese pilots, flying without radar guidance and often with incomplete intelligence, frequently arrived over the American fleet already out of formation, low on fuel, and unaware that fighters were waiting for them at altitude. The F-6F Hellcat proved devastating in this environment. Designed specifically to counter the Zero, it combined rugged construction, heavy firepower, and excellent performance at altitude. Unlike earlier American fighters, the Hellcat could absorb punishment and still remain flyable. Japanese pilots, accustomed to lightly built aircraft optimized for maneuverability rather than survivability, found themselves outmatched in sustained engagements. Many Japanese fighters were destroyed before they could even see their attackers, while others were shot down in brief, violent encounters that lasted only seconds. As wave after wave of Japanese aircraft was intercepted and destroyed, the sky filled with wreckage. Pilots later described seeing burning aircraft falling into the ocean, parachutes drifting downward amid tracer fire, and smoke trails crisscrossing the sky. American pilots often returned to their carriers with ammunition expended but fuel remaining, a reversal of the desperate situation faced by Japanese aircrews, many of whom were forced to ditch at sea after failing to locate their carriers or land bases. Fuel shortages became another critical factor in Japan's losses. The Japanese Navy had launched aircraft from extreme ranges in an attempt to stay beyond American strike distance. While this strategy theoretically allowed their carriers to survive longer, it meant that pilots had little margin for error. Navigation mistakes, combat maneuvering, or delays caused by interception often left aircraft without enough fuel to return. American submarines and destroyers later reported finding wreckage and oil slicks stretching for miles, evidence of aircraft lost not to gunfire, but to exhaustion and the unforgiving ocean. Meanwhile, American carrier operations demonstrated a level of efficiency and coordination that the Japanese could no longer match. Flight deck crews worked at extraordinary speed, launching and recovering aircraft in rapid succession. Pilots rotated through missions with disciplined precision, while damage control teams stood ready to respond instantly to any threat. Although a small number of American ships suffered minor damage from Japanese attacks, none were seriously threatened. The layered defense system, radar detection, fighter interception, and anti-aircraft fire proved overwhelmingly effective. As night approached on June 19th, the first day of the battle drew to a close with staggering results. Japanese losses in aircraft were already estimated in the hundreds, while American losses remained comparatively light. Yet the most decisive blows were still to come. While Japanese air power had been largely shattered, their carrier fleet remained afloat, and American commanders faced a critical decision. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, was cautious by nature and concerned about potential submarine threats and night attacks. He initially hesitated to launch a long-range strike against the retreating Japanese carriers late in the day, fearing that recovering aircraft after dark could result in heavy losses. This decision has been debated ever since. Some critics argued that a more aggressive pursuit might have annihilated the Japanese carrier force entirely. However, Spruance's caution reflected the strategic reality of the time. The United States could afford to fight another day. Japan could not. Even without a decisive surface engagement, the destruction of Japan's carrier air groups had already shifted the balance of naval power irreversibly. On June 20th, American reconnaissance aircraft finally located the Japanese fleet at extreme range, over 275 miles away. Despite the distance and the lateness of the hour, Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the Fast Carrier Task Force, ordered an all-out strike. Hundreds of American aircraft launched in what would become one of the longest-range carrier strikes of the war. Pilots flew deep into enemy-controlled airspace, fully aware that returning after sunset would be perilous. The strike achieved mixed tactical results. American pilots managed to sink the carrier Ohio and damage several other ships, but darkness soon forced them to turn back. The return flight became a desperate ordeal. Low on fuel, many aircraft struggled to find their carriers in the dark. In an unprecedented move, Mitcher ordered all carriers to turn on their lights, illuminating the decks to guide returning pilots despite the risk of submarine attack. This decision saved countless lives, though dozens of aircraft were still lost due to fuel exhaustion or crash landings. Even with these losses, the outcome was clear. Over the course of 2 days, the Japanese Navy lost approximately 350 aircraft and many of its remaining experienced pilots. American losses totaled fewer than 130 aircraft, many of them due to operational accidents rather than enemy action. The disparity was so extreme that American pilots began referring to the battle as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a grim nickname that reflected both the ease of the victories and the devastating imbalance between the two forces. The destruction of Japan's naval aviation arm during the Marianas Turkey Shoot marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a carrier-based fighting force. From this point onward, Japanese carriers would sail largely without trained aircrews, serving more as decoys than as offensive weapons. The battle also ensured that the U.S. invasion of the Mariana Islands would proceed without serious interference from Japanese carrier aviation, paving the way for the establishment of B-29 bomber bases within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. What made the Marianas Turkey Shoot so decisive was not just the number of aircraft shot down, but what those losses represented. Japan had lost the institutional knowledge, experience, and pilot corps that could not be replaced. Training programs had been shortened, fuel shortages limited flight hours, and combat veterans had been lost faster than they could be replaced. The United States, by contrast, possessed a deep reservoir of trained pilots, industrial capacity, and logistical support that allowed it to absorb losses and continue expanding its power. By the end of June 1944, the air war over the Pacific had entered a new phase. American air superiority was no longer contested in any meaningful way. The skies belonged to the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, and the consequences of that dominance would soon be felt over Japan itself. By the time the sun set on June 20th, 1944, the Pacific War had crossed a point of no return. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, remembered forever as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, was not simply a tactical victory or a one-sided air battle. It was the effective destruction of Japan's ability to wage carrier-based naval aviation for the remainder of the war. In just 2 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost more than 400 aircraft, the overwhelming majority of its remaining experienced carrier pilots, and 3 fleet carriers sunk with several others heavily damaged. The United States Navy, by contrast, lost fewer than 130 aircraft total, many of which were operational losses rather than combat shootdowns. The disparity was so vast that even senior American commanders initially struggled to believe the numbers coming in from strike reports and radar logs. The most devastating consequence for Japan was not the loss of aircraft themselves, but the annihilation of pilot experience. Japanese naval aviation doctrine had always relied on a relatively small cadre of exceptionally trained aviators, men who underwent years of intense preparation before ever seeing combat. Unlike the United States, Japan never developed a large-scale pilot training pipeline capable of rapidly replacing losses. Every pilot killed during the Marianas battle represented not just a missing aircraft, but an irreplaceable investment of time, fuel, instructors, and institutional knowledge. Many of the men lost during the Turkey Shoot had survived earlier battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomon Islands. Their deaths erased the last living link to Japan's pre-war carrier elite. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, demonstrated that it had fully mastered modern naval air warfare. Radar-directed interception, coordinated fighter control, layered air defense, and disciplined gunnery had turned American carriers into moving fortresses. The F-6F Hellcat proved to be exactly what its designers had intended, not a flashy dogfighter, but a brutally effective killing machine that exploited American strengths in engineering, firepower, durability, and pilot training. Against increasingly undertrained Japanese pilots flying outdated tactics, the outcome was inevitable. American pilots often reported that Japanese aircraft flew straight into defensive fire or attempted attacks with no coordination, no altitude advantage, and no situational awareness. Even the few Japanese aircraft that broke through the fighter screen were met by another wall of steel. American anti-aircraft fire had improved dramatically by 1944. Proximity fuses, better fire control systems, and constant training meant that carrier task forces could throw up dense curtains of flak that shattered incoming formations. Dive bombers were destroyed before entering their attack angles. Torpedo planes were annihilated long before they could line up on targets. In many cases, American sailors watched Japanese aircraft explode in midair without ever reaching release range. The final American strike on June 20th, though costly, sealed Japan's fate. Hundreds of U.S. aircraft pushed beyond safe fuel limits to hunt down the retreating Japanese fleet. While coordination broke down and many planes were lost returning in darkness, the strike succeeded in crippling Japanese carriers beyond repair. When Admiral Mitcher ordered carrier decks illuminated to guide home returning aircraft, an action that risked submarine attack, he made clear that American leadership now valued trained aviators as strategic assets, not expendable tools. The contrast with Japanese doctrine could not have been sharper. In the weeks following the battle, Japanese Naval Command quietly acknowledged the truth. Carrier aviation, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was effectively finished. The surviving carriers that remained afloat lacked trained air groups to operate from them. When Japan attempted to use carriers again at the Battle of Leyte Gulf later in 1944, they were reduced to decoys, empty hulls meant to lure American forces away from the real fight. The airmen who would have once filled their decks were gone, shot down in the skies over the Philippine Sea. For the United States, the victory opened the door to the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam soon fell, providing airfields from which B-29 superfortresses could strike the Japanese home islands directly. This was the strategic prize Japan had sought to prevent, and failed. Within months, American bombers were flying from captured islands, burning Japanese cities, and crippling industrial capacity. The long-range bombing campaign that followed was only possible because of the air superiority secured during the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Among American pilots, the battle quickly became legend. Stories circulated of aces racking up 5, 6, even 7 kills in a single day. Some pilots joked darkly that it felt unfair. Others recognized the sobering reality that they were witnessing the collapse of an enemy air arm, not simply winning individual dogfights. Many later reflected that the ease of victory was unsettling, knowing that it was built upon years of relentless attrition and industrial superiority rather than a single moment of brilliance. Historians today view the Marianas Turkey Shoot as the clearest demonstration of how wars are ultimately decided by systems, not heroics alone. Superior training pipelines, logistics, radar integration, command flexibility, and production capacity determined the outcome long before the first aircraft took off. Japanese courage and skill could not overcome these structural disadvantages. By 1944, the war in the air had become a contest Japan could no longer afford to fight. When the last wreckage sank beneath the Philippine Sea and the surviving Japanese carriers limped away, the balance of power in the Pacific was permanently altered. The skies belonged to the United States. From that moment forward, Japanese pilots would fly defensive missions, kamikaze attacks, or last-ditch sorties with no hope of regaining control. The age of Japanese naval aviation dominance, born at Pearl Harbor, ended in a single, devastating weekend. The Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just a battle. It was the moment the Pacific War became inevitable in its outcome.